glad to have you here. I realize that we're kind of entering a couple months where it might feel like things are a little sporadic as far as attendance goes, but we are so glad to have you here today as we come together as a community, as we get to spend some time worshiping together. And we're going to be starting out a new series today through the book of Exodus that's going to take us through the summer together. So we're really excited for that series. I know last time we were together, I wasn't here, but Natalie was, and Natalie spoke about spiritual gifts and the importance of using those gifts within community and having some expectation when we come together as a community for those gifts to flourish among us, and to expect that God is going to show up and use those gifts as we are faithful to, that God is going to do something as we are faithful to using those gifts among one another. And so we hope that you find space to do that today. In fact, we're going to be intentional about giving you some space to do that today a little later. But for now, we're going to spend some time worshiping, and we're going to invite you to stand with us as we sing. God, we thank you for today. God, this is so great to be together. We're thankful for this space, for this new season of summer that we're entering. And I realize that a lot of us are going to have opportunities to rest over this season. And so, Lord, I pray that it is a time of refreshing, a time of reflection, a time where we are just reminded on a daily basis of your goodness. And we get to look around and see the storms that blow trees and power lines over, and beautiful, hot, sunny days. God, you are so good, and all of this world and everything in it belongs to you, and we acknowledge that today. God, we thank you for this community and for words that we get to sing to you together, to give you praise, to acknowledge that you are our God. And Lord, as we sing these songs about your faithfulness, about you as our foundation, and songs that cry out to you, asking you to give us your eyes for us to see your hand at work around us, God. I pray that you do that today for us.
I'm calling on the God of Jacob, whose love endures through generation.
Over the last couple months, we have spent a lot of time talking about what happens when the Spirit of God is at work among a group of people. We've talked about the gifts that we've been given, the way that those gifts actually cause us to rely on one another, that this following Jesus thing isn't something that we do on our own. It's alongside others who have gifts to share, and we collectively are the body of Christ. We've talked about love, not just as something that makes being together a little easier, but as the thing that actually makes community possible. And then Natalie talked about what happens when we live, not just as people who are aware of God's Spirit with us, but expectant, people who are expectant that God can and will bring power and healing and encouragement and wisdom and transformation when we come together and use the gifts that he has given us, that God has given us. And in a lot of ways, I think Exodus picks up right where we left off, because this is also a story about a people learning what it means to live together in a different way. Most of us probably think of the story of Exodus and we think about freedom. And obviously this is a story about freedom. It's the story of God rescuing people from slavery and leading them out of Egypt. But as we'll see together, getting them out of Egypt is really only just the beginning of the story. God doesn't just set them free and then kind of turn them loose and say, hey, good luck, guys. He sends them on. God is forming them into a new kind of community, and that turns out to be a much longer and more difficult process than they maybe would have thought. And these are people who have spent generations living in Egypt and being shaped by Egypt, by its ideas about power and fear, about scarcity and productivity, about who has power and who doesn't. And so even after they leave, they're going to have to learn a different way of seeing the world and a different way of living together as the people of God. And in some ways, getting out of Egypt happens pretty quickly. Physically, they leave the location, but there's all this baggage that comes with them. And so learning how to live like they're actually free takes a little bit longer. And I think that's part of what makes this story worth spending some time in, because that's not so different from the work that God continues to do in us. Following Jesus isn't simply just about being rescued from something or deciding what we no longer believe. It's about being formed into a different kind of people. It's about learning a different way of living together. And so this summer, as I said, we're going to spend some time through this book of Exodus. And I think for most of us, again, when we hear this word Exodus, or we hear about the book Exodus, we probably think we know where this story is going, right? Moses, the burning bush, the plagues, the Red Sea, the Ten Commandments. Maybe, if depending on your age, maybe that movie by Charlton Heston comes to mind, the Ten Commandments. Anybody seen that one before? I think it's from the 50s. That was like a go-to as in my childhood. But the book of Exodus doesn't actually begin with any of those things. It begins by looking backward. Exodus is the book right after Genesis in the Old Testament, and Genesis ends with the story of Joseph. Now, many of us know the story of Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Joseph is sold by his brothers and taken to Egypt as a slave. But through this whole series of events, eventually finds himself in this position of incredible power. And then when a famine threatens the land, Joseph ends up in this position where he's able to save a lot of people, including the same family that sold him into slavery. And so Genesis ends up with Joseph welcoming his family into Egypt and taking care of them there. And Exodus picks up the story somewhere down the road, which we see in Exodus chapter 1 in verse 6. We read this. Now Joseph and all of his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. And so they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom, and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. And so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So that's Exodus verses 6 to 14, which sets up our story for today. And it sets up the entire story of Exodus, really. Today, we're just going to kind of get to the edge of the story of baby Moses. But there's some really important stuff here already in the text that I think sets us up for where we need to spend our time today. Now, I already talked about why Exodus starts with Joseph, but let's go back to that for a second. Because really, one of the most important verses in the entire narrative is found in verse 8. The verse says, and then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. It's really easy to kind of blow past a verse like this and not really think much about it. But I mean, we get it. Like, time has passed and a generation has died. The new king is so far removed from Joseph that he doesn't know anything about him. But there's a lot more to it here. And depending on the translation you're reading, we often read New Living Translation, NLT here. But today I opted to go with a different translation, NIV. And I'll explain that in just a second. But depending on the translation you're reading, in verse 8, they're working with this original Hebrew word, which is yada, which means to know. And it's not just as simple as saying, I know so-and-so, like I know this person. We recognize that to know something or someone is a very layered word. Other translations, including the NLT, which as I said, we typically would read from, says, eventually a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he'd done. So as I said, we understand the nuance that goes along with the idea of knowing someone, but to say Joseph knew nothing feels a little bit too literal. I mean, everything within this story itself. This isn't some small detail that Egypt would have just forgotten, that the historians of Egypt would have just forgotten. This 7-year famine that we're talking about, that Joseph saw the people through, wasn't just a blip in the radar. It was something that reshaped the country. It played a big role in Pharaoh ending up with the kind of power and control that he actually had. They had storehouses, right? Full of grain. So people spent all their money buying food from Pharaoh. And then when the money ran out, they traded their livestock. And then when that ran out, they ended up selling off their land to Pharaoh, which Pharaoh then had them work. And then he charged them massive amounts so he now owned the land and charged them to be able to grow their crops. Sounds like a very similar cycle that we've seen throughout the rest of history. So this wasn't just a small blip in Egypt's history. And so you would have a hard time convincing me that the king knew nothing of Joseph here, which is what some of these translations say. And so this NIV that we've read today probably depicts a bit more of what's going on here. It says again that a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. It's probably less that Pharaoh had never heard of Joseph and more that Joseph just didn't matter to him. Not necessarily ignorance, but more just like indifference. I don't really care, right? It doesn't really matter. It doesn't affect me, when in reality it did. And I think that's why Exodus starts by reaching back to Joseph in the first place. The writers of the Hebrew scriptures are constantly doing this. They're always linking one story to another because they understand that the present is never just floating out there on its own. The present is always connected to something that came before it. And the way we remember or fail to remember what came before us is a way of shaping what comes next in our lives. And so Exodus doesn't just say a new king came to power in Egypt. It says a new king came to power in Egypt to whom Joseph meant nothing. And that matters because Joseph is the reason his family is in Egypt in the first place. Joseph is part of the reason Egypt survived the famine. Joseph's story is a part of Egypt's story. And so his story matters. But now there's this king who doesn't remember this story or doesn't care enough to let this story shape him. And it's almost as though the writer is saying that forgetting the story is what makes oppression possible. What's interesting is that the rest of the Exodus is really a story about remembering. Deuteronomy 5:12, observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God has brought you out of there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Deuteronomy 15, if any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt and the Lord your God redeemed you. Deuteronomy 24, 19 to 22. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your tree, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. See what's happening here? Over and over again, when God tells Israel how to live, the reason is the same. Remember. Remember what it felt like to be a slave. Remember what it felt like to have nothing. Remember what it felt like to be an outsider. And then don't build another Egypt. Don't build another empire like that. Rest and allow other people to rest, because you remember what it was like when Pharaoh never let you stop working. Release people from what they owe you, and when they leave, don't send them on their way with nothing, because you remember what it was like to have nothing. Leave something behind for the foreigner and the vulnerable, because you remember what it was like to live on someone else's land. All of it hinges on remembering where the story comes from and how they ended up here. And so right out of the gate, Exodus gives us this contrast. Pharaoh, the empire that Pharaoh represents, forgets, God's people are told to remember. Because forgetting has a way of leading us back towards Egypt. Remembering is part of how we learn to live as free people. And there are so many ways we've turned this into everyday wisdom for today, right? We all know the saying, those who forget their past are doomed to repeat it. When somebody shows you who they are, believe them. Or maybe Einstein's line, insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. I mean, we chuckle because they're true. But like, how many of us have actually looked back over our lives and thought, like, how did I end up here again? Like, seriously? I said I'd never lose my temper like that again. I said I'd never make that stupid purchase again. I'd never get into that relationship again. I'd never let work consume me like that again. I'd never carry that bitterness again. And somehow, here we are again. It's wild how quickly we forget. And when we do, we end up looking more like the king who arose and cared nothing for Joseph than the people God was trying to form. Because this isn't just about the facts of the past. It's about whether we let our story actually shape us. Pharaoh may have known the story of Joseph, but it didn't mean anything to him. And so we read that the king said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them. And so they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Batum and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. Now there's another interesting thing here. First, we're told that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites, which kind of makes sense, right? I'm sure they feared, and we're actually told that they feared the Israelites might rise up, join with the neighbors and rise up, and that makes complete sense. But the meaning of the word that's actually used here is more along the lines of loathing. And so the intent here has more to do with animosity than it does with fear. And this is how it happens. It starts with loathing. We don't like them. Then someone tells us that we should be afraid of them. And once we're afraid of them, we can almost justify anything we do to them to keep them from taking over our country. And that's a storyline that's very easy for us to fall into. Like, I deserve this. Especially if we don't remember our past. Like, here's the truth. Most of us here in this room, we are settlers on indigenous land who somehow instinctively feel that we have the right to control who gets to come here next. And yes, I understand immigration is a super complex issue, but if we forget how we got here and the suffering that was caused, how are we supposed to navigate the future honorably? To quote from the end of Exodus, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner. Why? Because you were foreigners once. Look how easily things begin to escalate when the dominant group gives itself permission to even just slightly diminish the humanity of those that they see as a threat to them. Let's pick up where we left off in verse 14. It says, they made their lives better with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. We read this already, but that word that gets that we get ruthlessly from means to crush or grind or crumble or crunch, and more simply just means violence. And so violent laws lead to verse 15 here. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. I mean, think about that. In 8 verses now, we've gone from a king who's not concerned about the past to this animosity that turns into dehumanizing fear of the other, to oppression that very quickly becomes just outright murder. Things can escalate so quickly, and I think the writer wants us to see that here. If we let these ideas take hold of us, they take us to places that we never thought we would go. And then right in the middle of all this, the story gives us two names. Pharaoh is never named here. The most powerful man in the world is just Pharaoh. But the midwives here are Shiphrah and Puah. The empire may not think they matter, but the storyteller makes sure that we remember them. So let's talk about Shiphrah and Puah here for a minute. There's some debate about the identities of these women. Now, these aren't necessarily straightforward Hebrew names. And so because of that, it's raised this question, well, are they actually like Israelite midwives, or are they midwives that are assigned to the Israelites to help with childbirth? And after all, like if they are actually Hebrew, why would Pharaoh ever think that they would just go along with all of this? Like they would take this command and, oh, okay, we're going to kill off all these babies who are a part of our bloodline. And that's a fair question. But I don't think the writer is trying to get us to doubt their identities. I think the writer is trying to get us to demonstrate something about the corruption of power here. Remember, this king is so deeply focused on himself, without any regret for the past. He's so focused on himself here and now that he can't even comprehend the idea of a future where someone would refuse his orders, regardless of how dehumanizing they might be. It's like, I'm the Pharaoh. I'm telling you to do something. Obviously, you're going to do it. And that's the problem. And I mean, if the Israelites had that kind of numbers where they're becoming a threat to the Egyptians, they're clearly going to need more than just 2 midwives to help with all the births that are happening. I'm guessing. I don't work in labor or in delivery, but so likely what we're seeing here is that Shiphrah and Puah are probably 2 heads of a Hebrew like birthing guild, essentially like the union leaders over this group of midwives. And so they're called in and ordered to pass on to these other women who do this work what the game plan is. And so what happens? We're not told a whole lot, which leaves us to fill in the gaps a little bit and use our imagination. And so to do that, I want to read you a longer section from Dr. Will Gaffney, who you've heard me share from before. She is a Black female Hebrew scholar, and this is from her book, Womanist Midrash. And this is how she kind of imagines these 2, Shiphrah and Puah, leaving Pharaoh's court that day. Shiphrah and Puah call all the birthing women to assemble, telling their overseers that they are passing on Pharaoh's instructions. One Egyptian lingers longer than the others, and Puah shoos him out with the ancient womanist refrain, "This is women's business." He leaves, and hundreds of women come to the place of Shiphrah's tent. Many bring daughters, granddaughters, and nieces whom they are apprenticing into the profession. Some are pregnant, others are nursing. It takes more than a day for everyone to gather and eat and rest from their journeys. And there's this talk. Shop talk, women's wisdom, shared experiences and new techniques, herbs to stop the bleeding, herbs to bring on labor, teas to increase milk production, ways to limit pregnancies. Finally, Shiphrah speaks. She tells the Pharaoh's words, and the women gasp. Some mutter, some shout. Some of the children are frightened. Shiphrah and Puah shush them and call for calm. Shiphrah begins to prophesy, God has brought our people a mighty long way. And I don't believe God has brought us this far to leave us. Do not fear this Pharaoh or his warriors, not his war horses nor his chariots. God will blow them away like smoke in the wind. In our days, before our eyes, God will break the back of empire and wash it away its might. God will raise up one of our sons to lead us and all our children out of this house of slavery. Our hands and our wombs do God's work. We will deliver the deliverer. We will keep him safe until the day that God calls him to lead us to freedom. Shiphrah takes her seat, and Puah speaks, trust in God whose name is holy. This is what we shall do. Deliver the babies. Hide as many of the boys as you can and raise others as girls. Do not worry about the Egyptians. They will not come to the house to check on women. They cannot imagine that we would defy the Pharaoh whom they revere as a living God. The women leave the convocation of birthing women. Days, weeks, and months go by. Pharaoh is too busy thinking about the Hebrew birthing women. Someone mentions that the Hebrew people are still growing, and in spite of Pharaoh's commandments, he summons them back to explain themselves. And here back into Exodus 1, verse 19, the midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives can even get there. Now it's kind of interesting. They end up using Pharaoh's words against him. That word vigorous is actually more like brutish or animalistic. They're not refined like Egyptian women. So they're like playing him here, right? They're feeding into where he's going. And it seems like it works because the very next verse we read is God was kind to the midwives. And the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Now that word families might mean families as we understand it, but it's more likely it means lineages and dynasties, long stories of their own, or descendants from today. But I like what Daphne says here. She says the liberation of the Israelite people begins with Shiphrah and Puah. They are the mothers of a revolution waged first by women. Now here's what's important about that. We're not once given the impression that Shiphrah and Puah were ever involved with or that they ever delivered Moses, because that's not the point of the story. In fact, the point of the story is the opposite of this. See, the point is that when we know where we come from and we live out that grounding narrative, even out of great risk to ourselves, we can inspire great things in others. And that's how revolution starts. Shiphrah and Puah aren't named in the text of Exodus because they saved Moses. They're named here because they kept the story alive long enough for Moses to even enter the story. And I mean, sometimes that's the faithful work. Sometimes that's the harder work, keeping something alive long enough for someone else to carry it forward. I have one more thing that I want us to look at today. When Pharaoh finds out that his plan hasn't worked, he turns the dial up on the violence even more because that's what happens. It doesn't work. It's not getting the response. It's not getting the response to the result he'd hoped for, and so he tries again. This time he orders all the Hebrew boys to be thrown into the Nile River to drown. But one mother who's been hiding her son for 3 months now, and she eventually realizes that she needs to do something drastic here. And so she makes this basket. She makes it waterproof and then floats her son out of the river, trusting God to look after him. Imagine being in that place where you're just like giving up your children and just trusting that God's going to care for them. Now you might remember this story, or if it's completely new to you, Pharaoh's daughter just happens to be there that day and she sees this basket and realizes that this is one of the Hebrew children and has compassion on him. But she knows she's going to need some help, right? And so she sees this girl hiding in the reeds who ends up being the sister. And the sister speaks up and says, hey, do you want me to go find one of the Hebrew women to care for this child? And she's like, yeah, I think we're going to need that help. So she goes and she ends up getting Moses' mom and brings her back to care for and raise her own child, which I mean is a little convenient, right? In fact, Jewish commentators often play up the divine irony here. Nahum Sarna points out that when Pharaoh's daughter says to Moses' mother, here, take him and nurse him for me, in chapter 2, verse 8, she's using a word here that implies ownership. So he suggests that we could translate it to something that sounds more like here. He's your responsibility now. He belongs to you. So take care of him and nurse him for me. Without even realizing what she's saying, there's this unconscious acknowledgement of her motherhood in the language that's being used here. And I think this is where the writer wants us to pay attention. The story that eventually gives us Moses, the person who will stand before Pharaoh and lead his people out of bondage, doesn't begin with Moses. It begins with a king to whom the past means nothing. It continues through 2 midwives who refuse to cooperate with power It begins with a mother who refuses to give up on her child. It begins with a sister watching from the riverbank, and even an Egyptian woman who allows compassion to matter more than whatever she's been taught to believe about the Hebrew people. And none of them knows where the story is going. They don't know. They don't know who this baby's going to end up growing up to be. Shiphrah and Puah don't know that there's going to be a Moses. Moses' mother has no idea what her son is going to become. Pharaoh's daughter certainly has no idea what she's setting in motion when she pulls this child from the water. They're just doing the next thing that they know how to do. And sometimes that's all we get to do. We don't always know what part of the story we're in. Sometimes we get to be at the center of it, and sometimes we play what feels like a very small part off to the side. But small doesn't mean insignificant. When we get to the end of chapter 2 and the story really starts kind of moving along, we read that the Israelites groaned in their slavery and they cried out for help, and that God heard their groaning and was concerned about them. But Exodus has already made sure that we know this isn't where the story starts. It had already been moving through Shiphrah and Puah, through mothers and daughters, through people whose names that we know and many whose names we have no idea about. And I wonder if that's part of what it means for us to remember where we come from. Not just knowing the facts, because Pharaoh probably knew the facts of Joseph. He knew the story. He knew what had happened. But paying attention to the story and allowing it to shape the kind of people they would become wasn't something he was interested in. We need to look back, remembering what it felt like to need help. And so we notice the person who needs help now, remembering the grace that we've received. And so we become people who extend grace. Remembering the times someone refused to give up on us, and so maybe we refuse to give up on someone else. Because Pharaoh forgot, and his forgetting led people towards death. Shiphrah and Puah remembered who they were, and they did the next thing that they knew how to do. Something that God had gifted them in, and somehow long before Moses ever arrived, the story of liberation had begun. And so maybe our faithfulness as followers of Jesus is as simple as that. Remembering who we are and the story we belong to, paying attention to what is happening around us and doing the next thing we know how to do, trusting that even when we can't see where the story is going, the part we play can still help move it toward greater freedom and wholeness. So I want to actually just encourage you. I wonder if you've ever I know for a fact some people in this room have, but I wonder if you've ever deeply considered your story before. If you just sat down with a piece of paper and worked through a timeline of your identity, considering your upbringing, where you were born, where your lineage comes from, all these milestone moments in your life. Just take some time to consider what my story is, and not just sit with them as facts, but to actually take some time and consider, God, why does this matter? How has this shaped me to be who I am? And what are you leading me towards after going through that? We're going to take, as I said, we're going to take some intentional time this morning with this idea of doing the next thing that we know how to do. As I mentioned last time we were together, Natalie wrapped up our Common Good series by talking about what can happen when we come together like this. Because all of us are bringing something into this room. Different gifts, different experiences, different ways the Spirit might be working through us for the good of someone else. And we've been talking about wanting to be more intentional with actually making space for that together as a community. oftentimes we wrap things up, and it's really hard for us to just sit in that space. And so I'm not actually going to close in prayer. I'm going to do what Natalie did last time, not actually close in prayer until after that time. So it's we're just going to linger for a little bit together. And so for the next 10 or 15 minutes, there's no one thing you have to do. This could look different for each of you. You could turn to the person beside you. You could gather around a table and just kind of sit and listen. But we want to use this time to care for one another as a community. And this might look like, I already saw it going on when we got here this morning. Take some time to pray with someone. It might just look like having a conversation and connecting on a deeper level beyond just, hey, how was the week? But how are you? And making sure that people within this space feel seen today. And then do the next thing that you know how to do. If it's sit and pray with this person, if it's hey, that sounds like you've had a really crazy week this week. Can I drop a meal off for you or something hospitality, whatever that looks like in the context of the conversation, do the next thing that you know how to do. And so let's just take some time together and have those conversations, and I'll come back in shortly and close in prayer. All right, I know some people are still praying, but
it's like this. I
know some people are still praying, but we're just going to close off for those of you that need to head out today. So if you're praying, please continue. God, thank you for meeting us here today. We thank you for this gift of being together. Thank you that we can just slow down, that we don't have to rush, and that sometimes we can just simply make space to pay attention to one another and to you, and whatever might be happening in our lives. Lord, I thank you for the vulnerability this morning amongst these clusters that have met and shared. Lord, would you continue whatever you've started among us today? Help us to become people who notice, people who choose compassion when it would be easier to look away, people who refuse to go along with things that diminish others, people who are willing to do the next faithful thing that we know how to do, even when we don't know where it's headed. Help us to trust that we don't always need to know where this story is going, and sometimes we just need to be faithful in whatever is right in front of us. And keep forming us into the kind of community, Lord, that we've been talking about over these last few weeks, a community where we learn to use whatever we've been given for the good of one another, where we remember this story that we belong to, and where we keep learning how to move together towards greater freedom and wholeness. We ask these things in your name. Amen. Amen. As I said, sorry to interrupt if you're continuing to pray or if you're in the middle of conversation. There's no rush, so please feel free to continue. And we'll wait probably another 5 minutes or so before we start to tear down if we can. So blessings, guys. We hope you have a great week.
I want to see